How could an entire civilization simply vanish, leaving behind only whispers and a scattering of impossible maps? What arcane secret, then, was powerful enough to not only erase it from history but devour every soul who dared to seek its truth? Even after all these years, after all I've seen and lost, the real terror isn't that I never found it, but that I still don't know if I truly escaped its clutches. Even now, the quiet hum of the old house at this hour, long after the last of my tea has gone cold, takes me back to the library stacks, the air thick with forgotten dust and the metallic scent of old paper. I was a young woman then, full of the kind of certainty that only comes from having read too many books and experienced too little of the world. My dissertation proposal, a truly arrogant thing, aimed to definitively locate the fabled Ciudad de las Brumas, the city of mists, as the Spanish conquistadors called it, or what others knew as a particularly elusive variant of El Dorado. Not the gold, mind you, that never interested me. It was the existence. The fact that something so grand could simply vanish. My early research was a pilgrimage of archives. London, Madrid, Lima. Every musty corner that housed the fevered scribblings of men driven by avarice or faith. I learned to decipher the hurried hand of a priest detailing a massacre, the meticulous entries of a cartographer who'd never seen the lands he mapped, the despairing scrawl of an explorer whose dream had turned to fever and delirium. It was in a small, provincial library in Colombia, tucked away in a collection of Jesuit missionary accounts, that I first encountered Alistair Finch. Not in person, not yet. He was a ghost in the margins of a 17th-century report, a meticulous, almost fanatical, series of annotations in a tight, almost microscopic script. Finch had been there, in those archives, decades before me, chasing the same mists. He'd left behind a trail of intellectual breadcrumbs, little question marks and exclamation points next to specific indigenous place names, local flora descriptions that seemed to diverge from the main text, even a small, almost imperceptible sketch of a peculiar stone formation. That drawing, honestly, was the thing. Just a few lines, a rough outline, but it depicted a natural rock outcrop near a major tributary of the Magdalena River, a landmark mentioned briefly in a few obscure travelogues. But Finch had added a small, carefully drawn circle at its base, indicating something excavated, something added. That's when I stopped looking for the City of Mists and started looking for what Finch was looking for. No, that's not quite right. I realized he had already stopped looking for the City of Mists. He was looking for something else entirely. And whatever it was, it had changed his understanding of the legend. I found Alistair Finch years later, in a small, sun-drenched bungalow on the outskirts of Oxford. He was a man held together by tweed and tea, his eyes the color of faded expedition maps, sharp and full of a kind of quiet mischief. His shelves were not filled with academic accolades, but with indigenous pottery fragments, dried botanical samples, and stacks of his own meticulously bound journals, all handwritten. He smelled of pipe tobacco and ancient paper, the scent of a life lived in two worlds, the academic one he'd largely abandoned, and the jungle one that had clearly consumed him. Ah, the young lioness, he'd rasped, without looking up from the intricate weaving of a fishing net he was repairing. His fingers, surprisingly agile for an old man, moved with a practiced rhythm. Come to pick the bones of my failures. I remember the silence that followed, thick with the scent of jasmine from his garden. I had prepared a speech, a carefully worded explanation of my research, my discovery of his marginalia, my theories. But standing there, facing him, it all felt terribly insufficient. I came, I said, the words feeling clumsy, because your questions were better than my answers. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. A good start, Petrova. A very good start. Most people, they arrive with their certainties, like a poorly packed rucksack, spilling its contents at your feet. He paused, finally looking at me, his gaze unnervingly direct. What exactly do you think I was looking for? That was the question, wasn't it? I talked about the specific rock formation, the anomaly in the Jesuit text, the way he had ignored the grand narratives to focus on the small, almost invisible details. I spoke of the indigenous oral histories I'd started to collect, snippets that hinted at something other than a glittering city, something more subtle, a place of quiet strength, or the place where the river sleeps. He listened, occasionally grunting, his fingers still working the net. When I finished, the quiet stretched again, longer this time. You have, he said, slowly, the true explorer's affliction. You don't just want to find. You want to understand why it was hidden. This is exactly where everything changes, you see. Most people misunderstand the nature of an obsession like ours. They think it's about the glory, the headline, the picture on the cover of some glossy magazine. But for me, for Alistair, it was never about that. It became about a singular truth, a specific whisper that, once heard, could not be unheard. It was like a melody, just a few notes at first, out of tune with everything else, but then it grew, filling your mind, demanding to be sung. The real mistake here is thinking that proving something exists is the same as finding it. Sometimes, finding something is just the beginning of a much harder journey, the journey of what to do with it. Alistair knew this, I think, long before I did. He had a weary resignation in his eyes, a kind of peace that only comes from wrestling with a profound secret and choosing to carry its weight. He saw something in me, I suppose, the same reckless drive, the same intellectual hunger that had once consumed him. Maybe he hoped I would learn his lesson, or maybe he just wanted to ensure the secret would be well guarded, one way or another. He didn't give me maps or coordinates. He gave me a collection of faded watercolors, painted by a local artist he'd befriended decades ago. They depicted birds, trees, river scenes, but hidden within the vibrant blues and greens were subtle markers, a certain bend in the river, a specific type of palm, a pattern of shadows at midday. He told me, simply, they never built with gold, Elena. They built with silence. My own expedition was unlike any other I'd led. Finch, surprisingly, insisted on coming along, though he was frail then, his breath rattling in his chest like dry leaves. He moved slowly, deliberately, a living compass calibrated to the jungle's rhythm. We hired a small, local crew, mostly rivermen who knew the currents like their own veins, and one young guide, Matteo, whose family had lived in that valley for generations. Matteo was quiet, observant, and possessed a preternatural ability to read the forest. I, with my academic maps and satellite imagery, felt like an amateur beside him. We spent weeks navigating the labyrinthine waterways, the air thick with humidity, buzzing with unseen life. The jungle was a vivid, electric azure and amber, the canopy a dense, living roof that only let through slivers of the bright sun. Every leaf, every root, seemed to vibrate with untold stories. My research notes, meticulously organized, felt increasingly irrelevant. The truth wasn't in the paper, it was in the breath of the forest, the call of the unseen birds. One afternoon, a torrential downpour trapped us for 3 days. The river swelled to an angry torrent, the camp a soggy misery. Finch, huddled under a tarp, coughed incessantly. Matteo, however, was calm. He spent hours carving intricate patterns into a piece of soft wood, singing softly to himself in a language I didn't understand. It was during that time, trapped and vulnerable, that I truly began to listen to Matteo. I asked him about the legends of the City of Mists, about the old stories. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss them. Instead, he spoke of the place where the ancestors sleep without being disturbed, of the village that became the forest, of people who had chosen invisibility over dominion. My grandmother, he said, his voice soft, almost swallowed by the rain, she told me the outsiders, they always look for what shines. They never look for what hides. He gestured vaguely towards the dense, green wall of the jungle. Our people, they learn to hide from the light. He described specific plants, specific animal calls, specific rock formations that served as signals, not for a city, but for a presence. A series of markers, designed not to draw attention, but to deter it. These details resonated with Finch's watercolors, with the anomalies I had found in the archives. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness. I was looking for a city, a grand architectural feat, and they were telling me it was a living, breathing tapestry of evasion. My thoroughness, which I'd always considered my greatest strength, was now my greatest impediment. I kept trying to fit Matteo's narratives into my academic framework, to find the proof I needed. But the proof wasn't a ruin, it was an absence. It was the deliberate concealment. It was the lack of anything obvious. One morning, the rain finally lifted, leaving the jungle steaming, vibrant. Matteo led us away from the main river, through a tributary so narrow the canoe scraped against the roots of ancient trees. The light filtered down in shifting patterns of amber and green. We walked for hours, deeper and deeper, until the sounds of the main river were swallowed by the forest. He stopped at a place where a small, clear stream tumbled over a cluster of moss-covered rocks. Finch, leaning heavily on a walking stick, looked around, his eyes alight with a familiar, almost painful recognition. "This is it, Elena," he whispered, his voice thin but firm. "The threshold." I looked, but I saw nothing remarkable. Just jungle. Beautiful, overwhelming jungle. Matteo pointed to a particular vine, thick as my arm, that snaked up an enormous ceiba tree. "My grandfather," he said, "he would tell us that this vine, it breathes for the earth spirits here." He traced a line in the damp earth. "This is where they stopped building outward. And started building inward." We spent a week there, not digging, not clearing, but observing. Matteo showed me how certain clusters of trees were not natural, but arranged, providing shade in specific ways to hide faint pathways. How a particular type of flowering plant, vibrant azure against the deep green, always grew at the confluence of paths, not as a marker, but as a distraction. How the very ground, though covered in leaf litter, had a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation that suggested careful terracing beneath. It was an architecture of camouflage. The city of mists wasn't a lost city. It was a hidden world, still alive in its quiet wisdom, still breathing in the heart of the jungle. The indigenous people had not lost their city, they had transformed it, made it part of the forest itself, to escape the very kind of discovery we were trying to make. The legends were true, but I, and all the explorers before me, had been looking in the wrong direction, with the wrong tools, for the wrong kind of triumph. The moment the protagonist realizes they cannot unknow what they have found. That was me, crouched low, watching Matteo demonstrate how to gather water from a plant that seemed to spontaneously generate it, a plant cultivated not for food, but for survival in deep hiding. I realized then that every romantic notion I had held about unearthing a lost civilization was a destructive act. My prize, my academic glory, would be their ruin. I still don't know if I made the right choice. Maybe you felt this too, that particular burden of a truth too large to share, too fragile to expose. When we returned, Finch was weaker. He passed away a few months later, not in some grand academic ceremony, but quietly, in his garden, surrounded by the jasmine and the faint smell of tobacco. Before he died, we had a final conversation. I told him what I had seen, the architecture of silence. He listened, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. "So," he rasped, "you found it. Not the city of gold, but the city of ghosts." "The city of wisdom," I corrected, my voice thick. "Of survival." "And you will publish your findings, Dr. Petrova?" he asked, opening his eyes, his gaze piercing. I looked at him, remembering the exhaustion I felt, the strange, draining peace of knowing. The exhaustion of being right about something that could not be acted on. I thought of Matteo, of his grandmother, of the delicate balance they maintained. "No," I said, "I don't think I can." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Good," he said. "Because I found it too, you know. 40 years ago. Almost the same spot. Not the same clues, of course. My Matteo was named Conti. Different names, same knowledge. I spent years after that trying to reconcile it with my academic conscience. The pull of publication, the validation. The fear of being dismissed as a lunatic. But the greater fear was always the other one. The one that whispered of destruction. He paused, a fit of coughing shaking his frail frame. I learned, he continued, when he regained his breath, that some truths are not meant for the glare of the academic spotlight. Some truths are meant to be guarded. Not because they are wrong, but because they are too right. Too vulnerable. The confrontation was quiet, understated. No raised voices, no dramatic revelations. Just two minds, two lives, converging on the same profound, uncomfortable truth. It confirmed everything I had felt, everything I had learned, but it changed nothing in the wider world. The city of mists remained hidden, its secret kept, not by ancient magic, but by the conscious decision of two driven academics and generations of indigenous people who knew its true value. I never published my definitive findings on the Ciudad de las Brumas. My colleagues thought I had given up, or perhaps gone mad with jungle fever. I wrote papers on other aspects of indigenous culture, on historical climate patterns, on the archaeology of less controversial sites. I built a career, a respectable one, on everything but the truth that had consumed me. I'm not going to pretend this resolved cleanly. There's a part of me, the part that still hears the academic siren song, that wonders if I was a coward. If I betrayed my calling. But then I remember the way the light filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in hues of impossible amber, the silence that followed Mateo's soft words, the understanding in Alistair Finch's faded eyes. And I know the cost of that truth was simply too high. The old wooden chest sits in my study, its brass fittings dull with age. Inside, tucked beneath my father's old pipe and a collection of smooth river stones, is Finch's small packet of watercolors. They are faded now, even more than when he gave them to me, the vivid blues and greens muted by time. I trace the specific bend in the river he painted, the tiny, almost invisible palm, the pattern of shadows at midday. They mean nothing to anyone else. They mean everything to me. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, not by earth, but by choice. That, perhaps, is the truest expedition of all. What strikes me at this point is the sheer, unyielding weight of knowing something no one else believes, or worse, something that would cause irreversible harm if revealed. It's not just the burden of proof, it's the burden of consequence. And for someone who has dedicated their life to uncovering truth, deciding not to share it must be a profound and lonely act of self-betrayal, and self-preservation, all at once. Sometimes I think about Mateo, about his children, maybe even his grandchildren now. Do they still tend to the silence? Do they still tell stories of the ancestors who built their world within the forest, not with stone and mortar, but with careful, living camouflage? I imagine them, moving through the vibrant, electric azure and amber of the jungle, living a life that remains untouched by the relentless gaze of the outside world. And I wonder, if I had acted differently, would they still have that peace? Would they still have anything? The old chest, scarred and weathered, sits in the corner of my study, collecting dust. Sometimes, late at night, I run my fingers over the rough wood, imagining the jungle's damp heat, the rustle of unseen life. The watercolors inside are ghosts of places I can still see with perfect clarity. They represent a truth that only a handful of people have ever known, and only two chose to guard. It was an unbearable weight, then, and it is still. What would you have done, I wonder, if you had found a paradise, and the only way to keep it so was to ensure no one ever knew it existed? What would you have done if you were the narrator, holding the secret of the Ciudad de las Brumas? Would you have published your findings, or chosen to guard its peace, even if it meant betraying your calling? If you feel the weight of these choices, or if the whispers of untold truths stir something within you, then you found a place where those legends are always explored. Do you know someone who carries the weight of a truth too heavy to share, or who understands the cost of protecting something precious? Perhaps this story of the Ciudad de las Brumas might resonate deeply with them. If you'd found that hidden paradise, would you have chosen silence and preservation, or the truth of revelation? Tell me your decision in the comments right now, I want to hear it. If the profound burden of that hidden truth resonated with you, making you feel the weight of their impossible choice, the like button is waiting. If you're someone who understands the quiet power of hidden places and grapples with the true cost of their discovery, then you belong right here.